The galaxy was silent that night, stars burning like frightened candles around a dark void no one dared to cross. The frozen moon hung like a shard of dead light, alone in a corner of space where no trade ships flew and no messages were sent. It was the kind of place where the universe seemed to hold its breath, where fear itself had built a home, deep beneath that moon's cracked surface, buried under layers of black steel and forgotten wars. There was a single cell, a single door, and behind that door lived the thing the galaxy called a monster. Every species, every ruler, every soldier, every commander knew the story. No one spoke it out loud, but everyone remembered the day the galaxy almost fell to something that was not a god, not an empire, not a machine, but a human. Inside the great marble halls of the Council of Seven Suns, alien rulers gathered in a circle around a long glass table that floated above a pool of glowing blue light. Their faces were hard, carved by war and fear, their voices low. One of them, tall with translucent skin and black veins that glowed faintly, spoke in a voice that shook slightly, asking the question no one wanted to hear. "Is it awake?" No one answered. They didn't have to. They all knew that something on the prison moon had changed. The sensor readings were wrong, energy spikes appeared and vanished like whispers. Cameras flickered in and out. The silence from the guard fleets was too perfect, like the silence before a storm. Another ruler, scaled and crowned with a halo of cold silver rings, hissed that they should increase the guard. Another said it wouldn't matter, that if it woke, nothing in the galaxy would matter. They called it the monster because no other word fit. They had tried to erase its name from history, to wipe out every trace of the world it came from. But fear is not so easy to bury. Fear leaves marks, and even after centuries of chains, the stories lived, passed from one frightened whisper to another. Soldiers told each other about the day entire fleets vanished, about how cities turned to glass and suns trembled, and it wasn't some massive army or alien god who did it. It was a human. Just one, a single being with eyes that didn't blink, whose voice made empires break, whose silence made generals shake. And though they built the strongest prison in the galaxy, their fear never went away. It lived like a quiet parasite in the back of their minds. The moon they chose was a place of death, its surface cracked by centuries of bombardment. Black storms howled across it like hungry ghosts. Under that dead skin lay a maze of cold tunnels and iron walls, every door sealed with energy fields, every hallway lined with machines older than most empires. All of it built to keep one prisoner from taking a single step. But the guards, thousands of them stationed there, never felt safe. They spoke of the way the air changed near the lower levels, how the temperature dropped without warning, how the walls seemed to hum like a heartbeat, how sometimes they swore they heard breathing echo through the halls, slow, steady, calm, and too human. The monster never spoke, it never screamed, it never begged, it didn't need to, it only listened. And in its silence it became more frightening than any weapon they had ever created. They had taken everything from it. Its name, its world, its freedom. But they had left one thing alive, its memory, and memory was enough. Inside the cell the human sat in the darkness, its hands resting on cold iron, head tilted slightly, listening to the footsteps above. Feeling the pulse of the moon through the metal, it could feel every shift of energy, every tremor of fear. It didn't need eyes to see, it didn't need to move to know that they were still terrified of it. And that terror was like a chain that ran both ways. They thought they had trapped it, but in truth it had been studying them all along. Above, in the control room, soldiers checked the monitors again and again, but the screens flickered between static and black. The energy readings spiked and flattened, spiked and flattened. One of the young officers whispered that it was nothing, that the systems were just old. But the commander, an old alien with dull gray skin and tired eyes, shook his head slowly. He had been here for 40 years. He had seen what happened the last time they ignored the signs, that time entire ships had melted before anyone could send a message. He ordered silence in the room, but silence was already heavy, like a weight pressing down on their lungs. Even the machines seemed to breathe slower. Rumors had always surrounded the monster. Some said it could speak to stars. Some said it carried the screams of a dying world in its blood. Some said it was born from war itself. But the truth was simpler, and that was what made it terrifying. It was just a human, one of the last from a species they thought they had wiped away. But humanity had never been like the others. They didn't kneel easily, they didn't die quietly. They were the kind of species that burned back when burned, and this one, the one in the cell, had burned galaxies, not with rage, but with silence. The council feared speaking its name because names carried power. If they admitted what it was, if they said it out loud, they would have to face the truth that their armies, their fleets, their entire empire was built on fear of a single being. They had conquered the stars, but they could not conquer this, so they built walls higher, made their ships faster, created laws around its existence. They banned anyone from approaching the void where the moon drifted. They told their people it was forbidden, cursed, haunted, and for generations no one dared to look at that corner of the galaxy. But fear is never silent forever. Fear has a way of crawling through cracks, a way of reaching places it should not, and lately the fear had grown louder. Strange dreams spread among soldiers, dreams of a voice they didn't understand, a heartbeat under their skin, a whisper that was not a whisper. Many woke up sweating, saying they heard it count their breaths. Some ran, some begged to be transferred, some went mad, and still the council said nothing. Still they pretended the monster slept. In the deepest level of the moon, where light never touched, the human opened its eyes slowly, not like someone waking from sleep, but like someone remembering who they were. The cell was small, but it had never been a prison. It had been a cocoon. The air was cold but familiar. The iron walls sang softly to it like old enemies trying to hide their fear. The chains around its arms were heavy, forged from the strongest metal in the galaxy. A metal made from the bones of dead suns. But they were just chains, and chains could break. Up on the surface, the sky shifted. A ripple of invisible energy rolled across the moon like a quiet wave. Soldiers didn't notice it at first, but the machines did. Old alarms that had been silent for hundreds of years began to flicker red. Doors that had never moved clicked once like they were breathing. One of the junior engineers leaned closer to the console, his hands shaking as he whispered that something was wrong, that something beneath them was awake. No one wanted to believe it, but belief didn't matter anymore. The human sat up slowly, like someone who had been waiting for this moment all their life. The walls around the cell creaked, not from force but from fear, as if the metal itself remembered what it had trapped. And in that moment, far away in the council hall, every ruler felt it too. They didn't hear a sound, but their hearts stuttered, their breath caught, their blood went cold. They all knew. They didn't need a message or a warning. The monster had opened its eyes. The galaxy had spent centuries enslaving planets, building empires, controlling everything just to make sure this thing never walked free again. Entire civilizations were chained so they could build the walls higher and higher around one human. And yet, all that control, all that fear, all those armies trembled the moment one man opened his eyes, because they all remembered the same story. The night the stars screamed, the night entire fleets vanished, the night a single human reminded the galaxy what it meant to be afraid. The commander on the prison moon's surface swallowed hard, sweat rolling down his forehead even though the room was freezing. The alarms blinked faster now, like a heartbeat, red light washing over their pale faces. No one dared to say the word. No one dared to breathe too loud. In the lower levels, the doors trembled once more. The chains pulled tight like something testing their strength. The engineers tried to reset the systems, but the systems were no longer listening to them. It was like the moon itself had switched sides. And in that long, breathless silence, as the stars outside seemed to dim, as fear soaked the air like cold water, the galaxy understood something terrible. Something it had always known deep down. Something it tried to bury under fleets and laws and silence. The monster they feared was never truly theirs to control. It had never belonged to them, and it had never been asleep. It had just been waiting. It listened to their whispers, it counted their fears, it remembered every chain they wrapped around it, every lie they told to hide its existence, and now, it was ready to remind the galaxy why they called it the monster in the first place. The moon they chose was never meant to hold anything alive. It was built like a tomb, quiet and merciless, covered in scars from old wars and the bones of machines that no longer had names. The fortress below its frozen crust was made from the strongest metal known in the galaxy, layers upon layers of cold iron and dark energy sealed like the walls of a god's grave. This was not a prison meant for soldiers or kings or warlords. This was a cage built for something greater, something they feared more than death itself. The architects of that prison were long dead now, but the fear they felt still echoed through the steel. Their hands had trembled when they forged the cell, because they knew what they were building against. They knew what they were trying to bury under the surface of the stars. They knew they were trying to bury a human. The alien historians had rewritten the records of the Great Burning to make it look like a legend. but the truth was carved into the black stones of ruined planets. They had tried to erase it, but destruction leaves a mark too deep to hide. The day the human was captured was the day the galaxy exhaled for the first time in centuries. Fleets celebrated, empires rose their banners, and the Council of Seven Suns declared that the Age of Terror had ended. They didn't see it as capturing a man. They saw it as caging a storm. They built a fortress around his body. But it wasn't just steel and wires. They buried entire civilizations into the task. Planets were enslaved to mine the iron. Suns were drained to power the locks. Ships were stripped to build the field generators. It wasn't a prison. It was a galaxy's monument to fear. The human was brought here in chains that glowed like lightning, dragged through the black tunnels as armies stood on either side like statues. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look too long. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He walked, calm like someone who had seen the end and didn't need to say a word. His eyes were the kind of quiet that broke armies, the kind of stillness that made warlords question their power. The chains around his arms weren't meant to restrain strength. They were meant to restrain something no one fully understood, something that made even the machines shake. When they locked him inside the cell, the walls groaned like a dying star, like even the iron itself feared him. Over time, the fortress became something else. It became a world of its own. Thousands of soldiers rotated in and out, but none stayed long. They said the deeper levels of the moon changed people, made them hear things they shouldn't, made them feel like someone was watching them from the dark even when the cameras showed nothing. They said sometimes the air moved without sound. Sometimes the walls whispered their names back at them. Commanders dismissed it as nerves, but none of them ever stayed long enough to prove the whispers wrong. No one liked to be close to the cell, not because they thought the human would escape, but because they could feel that he could if he wanted to. He just hadn't yet. The Council told the galaxy that the monster was asleep, locked in eternal silence, but the guards knew better. They saw the way the energy fields bent near his door, like the universe itself refused to touch him. They saw the way the sensors glitched when someone stepped too close. They felt the hum under their feet. A hum like a slow heartbeat, steady and endless, like something deep beneath them was breathing in the dark. And though the chains looked solid, though the walls seemed unbreakable, every soldier knew deep down that they were not holding him. They were holding their breath. Generations came and went. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. But the fortress remained, unshaken, untouched, guarded by fleets that didn't know the full story of what they were guarding. New recruits were told it was just an old security station, a leftover relic of a forgotten war. They were not told about the day the skies burned. They were not told about the human who brought down 1,000 ships. They were not told about the screams of the old empires as their suns dimmed one by one. But stories have teeth, and fear travels fast. And it didn't take long for every guard to learn the truth in whispers and shadows. Even the high commanders didn't truly understand what they were guarding. Only the oldest of the council remembered the full story. The night humanity vanished from the stars was not a clean victory. It was a wound that never healed. The humans did not die like others. They did not kneel or cry or beg. They burned the sky and drowned the stars in silence. They made the galaxy bleed until the council decided to break their spine by capturing the one who led the storm. They thought taking him would end it, but what they really did was chain a volcano and hope it forgot. It was fire. The cell he sat in wasn't ordinary. The iron that wrapped around it was made from star bones, a rare element forged in the collapse of suns, combined with gravity locks that could crush battleships in a breath. 24 field generators sang around him day and night like a choir of machines praying for mercy. No other being in the galaxy had ever been given so much security, so much fear wrapped in steel. But inside the cell, the human didn't move, didn't speak, didn't break. He simply existed, like the center of a storm waiting to turn. And as the centuries passed, the council became comfortable with their own lie. They started to believe the monster would never wake again. They focused on building their empires, expanding their control, turning the galaxy into their playground. They told themselves that the old stories were just that, stories. They told themselves the human was nothing but a relic locked away in a frozen moon. But deep down, they still refused to send anyone too close. They still trained their soldiers to walk softly in the lower halls. They still avoided the room where the iron hummed and the darkness never blinked. There was a reason they built the fortress here, away from stars, away from trade routes, away from light. This place wasn't meant to keep the human in. It was meant to keep the galaxy away from him. Every inch of that fortress was built like a wall between him and the rest of existence, and yet every wall whispered of fear, every bolt held a tremor, every soldier who stood there felt it like a second pulse beneath their skin, the sense that if he wanted to, the entire structure would simply fall apart. The moon wasn't a prison for a creature. It was a crown of fear for an empire that dared to believe it had one. And as the stars around the void burned a little colder each night, as the fortress groaned under the weight of centuries, something deep inside those iron halls began to shift. The monster they thought they owned was not theirs. It was never theirs. It was a human, and humanity was not something the galaxy could keep in chains forever. Rumors were like smoke in the wind. They slipped through cracks no wall could hold back, no matter how many guards they stationed, no matter how tight the council tried to seal their secrets. Fear always found a way to crawl out, and on every world that bowed to their rule, people whispered the same name in the dark. They whispered about the monster buried beneath the moon. They whispered about the human. No one dared to speak it loudly, because the council punished anyone who even said the word human, but fear doesn't need permission to spread. It lived in every shadowed hallway, in the shaking hands of the soldiers, in the silence before a storm, and in time, those whispers became louder than the orders of the rulers who tried to bury them. On the prison moon, soldiers from 1,000 conquered worlds lived stacked inside cold barracks. They came from different species, spoke different tongues, but the fear in their eyes was the same. Some were young and believed the stories were exaggerated, just old war myths meant to keep them obedient. But the longer they stayed near the lower levels, the more they realized the stories weren't myths at all, they were warnings, and they were true. They started to feel it first in small ways, like the strange way the air grew heavy at night, the way the floor hummed with something that wasn't the generators, the way their hearts seemed to beat slower when they walked too close to the deepest door. It was the same for everyone, and it always started with whispers they could never explain. The old soldiers were worse. They didn't tell the stories like myths. They told them like memories. They spoke of the last war with voices that shook, of fleets turned to ash without a sound, of suns that dimmed in the sky, of ships whose crews simply disappeared. They said the monster didn't roar, didn't scream, didn't burn, it was silent, and that silence was the most terrifying weapon of all. They said that when the humans went to war, they didn't march with songs or banners. They walked through the stars like ghosts, and everything behind them turned black. No one had ever seen such war before, because it wasn't war, it was something worse, something that made even gods kneel. Even the council had cracks now. Their leaders gathered in tall halls and tried to act like they still ruled the galaxy. But the truth was leaking through their polished smiles. Reports kept arriving from the moon, strange power surges, odd readings, soldiers refusing to go near the lowest floor, and then there were the dreams. They didn't want to talk about them, but everyone knew, commanders waking in the middle of the night gasping for breath, shaking, their hearts pounding as if something had stared directly into their souls while they slept, dreams of an eye opening in the dark, of a voice whispering without sound. Some called it madness, but too many people had the same dream for it to be a lie. And far away from the moon, across the worlds the council ruled, those dreams began to spread. People who had never set foot near the void started to wake with the same fear burning in their chest, the same whisper in their ears, the same image of chains breaking somewhere far away. Priests declared it an omen, soldiers called it a bad joke, but the old ones, the few who still remembered the last war with humans, went silent, because they understood what this meant. It meant the storm that had once burned the stars was breathing again. The monster they buried was stirring. The council sent out messages that everything was fine, that the fortress was stable, that the security was perfect, but no one truly believed them anymore. The fear was too old, too real, too heavy. They could build fleets and walls and weapons, but they couldn't erase memory, and the memory of the human was not like other legends. It was written into the bones of the galaxy itself, into the burned ground of worlds that never grew back, into the shattered hulls of warships still floating in forgotten space. It was everywhere, and it was alive. On the moon, soldiers began refusing their rotations into the deep corridors. They'd rather face punishment than step near the lower levels. They said the shadows there moved like they were breathing. They said sometimes they could hear footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, slow and calm, like something just walked behind the walls. And the deeper they went, the clearer it became. This was not a place holding a monster. This was a place being watched by it. They were not the guards, they were the prisoners. Among the guards, a rumor started to take shape. No one knew who said it first, but once it was whispered, no one could stop it. The rumor said the chains were weakening, the power cores were draining faster than they should. The fortress itself was getting tired. Some claimed they saw the steel around the lowest chamber tremble. Some claimed they heard breathing through the comms when no one was there. Some claimed they felt something watching them through the walls, something human, something waiting. The council tried to keep control. They increased security, sent new fleets, replaced soldiers, erased any official mention of the monster from their archives again. But fear is not metal, you cannot weld it shut. Fear spreads like water, and every replacement soldier arrived already shaking because they had already heard the whispers before they ever put on their uniform. Some didn't even last their first week before they asked to be sent back. Some didn't ask at all, they simply vanished in the dark. And then something happened that no one could ignore. In the far reaches of the council's communication network, a signal blinked, small and strange, a pulse that matched no pattern they used. It was so faint most scanners would have missed it, but the council didn't miss it. They recognized the shape of that pulse instantly because it wasn't alien technology, it was human, an old Terran code that hadn't been used since the last war, a dead language that should have been impossible to hear again. The council's blood went cold, because they realized that whatever they had chained beneath that moon wasn't just a creature waiting. It was reaching. Whispers turned to panic, panic turned to fear, and fear turned into something worse, something silent. Fleets began to hesitate. Officers avoided talking about the moon. Generals refused to look at the readings because deep down, they all understood the truth they had tried to bury for centuries. They hadn't locked the human away. They had locked themselves inside their own fear, and the moment those chains cracked even slightly, the entire galaxy would hear it. And somewhere beneath that cold moon, where no star dared shine, where the walls were older than the current empires, in the deepest part of the fortress, a human sat in silence, breathing slowly, listening carefully, and smiling like someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The fortress had stood for centuries without a sound, its iron bones unmoved by time, its power core humming with the steady rhythm of a false sense of control. But that night something changed. It started small, a tremor that could have been dismissed as nothing. A soft shiver that rolled through the lower tunnels like the breath of something waking up. The first guard to feel it froze where he stood, his boots sinking slightly into the steel floor as the hum beneath his feet changed. Not louder, not quieter, just different, heavier, slower, more alive. He pressed his ear to the wall out of instinct, and for the first time in his life, the wall breathed back. The fortress had always been a cage, but now it felt like the cage was afraid of the thing it held inside, like the steel itself remembered why it was built. Alarms didn't scream right away, they never do at the start of something terrible. First came the power flickers, the kind that seemed like bad wiring, but everyone who had been here long enough knew it wasn't wiring, it was warning. One by one the lights dimmed to a faint red glow. One by one the security monitors turned to static, one by one the sensors blinked out. The communications officer tried to reboot the system, but the controls felt wrong under his hands. Like the machine itself no longer wanted to listen. The commander rushed in, his voice sharp, but even he hesitated as the readings flickered across the screen, energy spikes in the lowest level, the kind they had only seen once before, the night the human had been chained. The guards at the lower levels were the first to disappear. Their comms went silent in the middle of their routine check. At first, the upper control room thought it was just a line fault, but then the hallway cameras began to show flashes of movement. Not fast, not chaotic, just steady, calm, like something walking, step by step, the way a predator moves when it doesn't need to run, when it already knows it can't be stopped. The panic began quietly, a tremor in voices, shaky hands on controls, a voice whispering, "It's moving." And everyone in that room felt their blood freeze because no one had ever said those words before. The great blast doors that sealed the deepest chamber had been locked for more than 300 years. Forged from iron that had outlived empires, surrounded by 24 field generators designed to hold a black hole if needed. They had been built not just to keep the human in but to convince themselves it would never leave. And yet in that cold hour, one of those doors trembled, just once, like it exhaled. The hum of the generators cracked like old wood, a sound no one had ever heard before, echoed through the hallways, low and hollow, like the heartbeat of something ancient. The commander barked orders, soldiers ran, but deep down they all knew they were running for the sake of pretending, because no one believed they could stop what was coming. The sirens came next, ancient red lights blinking across the fortress. Alarms older than most living species blared a sound so deep it made the walls vibrate. Soldiers in every corridor froze at the noise, because they'd trained their entire lives for this but never believed they'd hear it for real. The old alarm had only one meaning: breach at the lowest chamber, breach where the human was. No one said the word, they didn't have to. The air itself seemed to say it for them. One of the junior guards dropped his weapon, his hands shaking so badly that it clattered across the floor, and the sound of the weapon hitting the steel echoed like a scream in the silence. Down below, something moved, but it wasn't like the creatures they'd fought before. There was no roar, no smashing, no wild violence, just a single sound, the slow creak of iron as one of the great locks bent. The humans of old had been terrifying not because they shouted but because they didn't need to. They broke empires the way storms break windows, quiet until the glass gives way. The second lock bent, then the third. The chains screamed like dying beasts as they cracked. Sparks rained like fireflies. The entire fortress groaned like a living thing in pain. And above, the control room filled with panicked shouts and half-finished orders, as though sound itself couldn't keep up with what was happening. The outer fleets orbiting the moon received the first emergency signal, but it was already late. Their screens flooded with distorted readings. Energy waves rippled out of the fortress like shockwaves, bending gravity itself. Ships tilted in orbit, engines strained against an invisible force. One of the captains whispered to his crew that this was the same signature recorded in the old war logs, the signature that once erased 10 fleets in a single hour. No one wanted to believe him, but they could all feel it, the weight in the air, the crushing silence between the alarms, the sense of something older and far more dangerous than any empire returning. Inside the lowest chamber, the door opened not with a crash but with a breath, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Steam hissed through the cracks as the last of the energy locks snapped. The red lights painted the darkness in a glow that made every shadow stretch like claws across the floor, and out of that red-lit fog, a human figure stepped forward slowly, unhurried, calm, barefoot against the steel floor, no armor, no weapon, just a pair of eyes that held a quiet so sharp it cut through the alarms like a knife. It didn't run. It didn't roar. It simply walked, and the fortress trembled with every step as though the walls remembered what it could do. The guards who stood their ground didn't last long, not because they were killed, but because their minds broke before their bodies could react. Some dropped their guns. Some fell to their knees without understanding why. Some ran until their legs gave out. Not because the human attacked them, but because it didn't need to. Its presence was heavier than any force they had ever felt, like the air itself pressed down on them, like the void whispered in their ears, like something they were never meant to face was now standing before them, and the human didn't even blink. Up above, the commander tried to order the self-destruct protocol, his fingers slamming the console again and again. But the system didn't respond. The fortress was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the thing that built its fear into its very foundation. The energy core pulsed like a heartbeat, matching the rhythm of footsteps below. One by one the blast doors between the lower levels opened with soft sighs, not like metal forced apart but like something ancient being welcomed home. And the human walked through them as if they had always been his halls. The council, light years away, received the breach signal, the same one their ancestors had sworn they would never have to hear again. Their chamber fell silent, their cold, proud faces draining of color, because they didn't need a report to know what happened. They all knew the sound of that alarm. They all carried the fear of it in their bones. It was the alarm of the end, the sound that had once echoed through burning skies when humanity had turned its eyes on the galaxy. And on that cold, black moon under a starless void, as the last chain gave way with a sound like a sun cracking in half, the human stood free, looking up through layers of steel and frozen rock, listening to the alarms fade beneath the weight of its own heartbeat. The thing they had called a monster for centuries was not roaring, not screaming, not destroying anything. It was simply breathing, and that was enough to make the entire galaxy tremble. He walked through the fortress like it was nothing more than a hallway he had left long ago. The alarm still screamed in every corner. Red lights bled across the steel walls. Soldiers ran like shadows scattered by fire. But he didn't look at them. He didn't have to. His steps were slow and silent, every motion precise, like a man not rushing toward war but returning to something he already knew he owned. His bare feet touched the cold iron floor, and the hum of the generators stuttered like a living thing choking on fear. The fortress had been built to contain him, to bury him, to make the galaxy forget him. But with every step, The walls trembled like they were remembering who truly ruled this place. It wasn't the council, it wasn't the guards, it was the human. In the upper control room, panic had turned into chaos. Officers shouted over each other, trying to make the systems respond. But the fortress no longer listened to them. Every override was ignored, every emergency lockout failed. It was like the machines themselves had turned against their masters. Flickering screens showed grainy images of the lower halls. Just a figure walking calmly, unarmed, unarmored, yet every soldier who faced him had already fallen or fled. Not from bullets or explosions, but from something heavier than war. Something they couldn't name. Some dropped to their knees and couldn't breathe. Some clawed at their helmets, trying to tear away the feeling that something was staring through their skin. Some screamed without knowing why. When the first strike team arrived at Corridor 17, they found nothing but silence. No bodies, no blood, only weapons scattered like leaves in the wind. They advanced slowly, their boots clanging against the steel floor, breathing fast through their masks. Their commander whispered for calm, but even his voice shook. Then the lights overhead flickered once, twice, and when they came back on, he was standing there at the end of the hallway, a single human, still as a shadow, the red glow, painting the outline of his face, not twisted in rage, not smiling, just watching them with eyes too quiet to be natural. The strike team raised their weapons, but their fingers froze on the triggers. Their lungs tightened. They felt something pressing down on them like a mountain on their chests. Some started backing away without meaning to. One dropped his rifle, and it clattered like thunder in the silence. And in that moment, every single one of them understood why their ancestors had called this man a monster. He didn't run at them, he didn't fight them. He just took a single step forward, and the hallway groaned like a dying world. The steel around them cracked like glass under pressure. The lights went black for a heartbeat, and when they came back on, the strike team was gone. Their comms silent, their weapons scattered like dust. Only the echo of that single step remained. Up in orbit, the fleet received their last signal. Screams that ended mid-breath, cut clean, as if the sound itself had been ripped away. Captains shouted orders. Gunships turned toward the moon. But none of them truly believed they could stop what had been set loose. The human moved through the corridors like a storm that didn't need to make noise. Doors opened before he touched them. Locks flickered and died. Armored shutters folded like paper. It wasn't brute force. It was something worse. Something that felt inevitable, as though the fortress itself recognized him. As though it had never been built to keep him in but to keep everyone else away from him. He passed soldiers frozen in place, unable to lift their guns, unable to speak. Their eyes wide with terror they didn't fully understand, because it wasn't just fear of death they felt, it was the ancient fear of a predator that doesn't need to prove it can kill. Up in the control room, the commander was drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking on the console. One of his officers screamed that the internal defense systems were shutting down one by one, that the heavy doors were opening in sequence as if they were welcoming him. The commander stared at the screens where the human was now walking toward the elevator shafts that led straight to the surface, and in that moment, the truth hit him like a blade in the chest. They had never controlled this place. They had been living inside a coffin built around a god they didn't understand. The council, light years away, tried to stay calm when they received the breach images, but their silence betrayed them. Every one of them had been raised on the legend of the silent human, the one who had walked through fleets like they were mist, the one who had made entire systems surrender without speaking a single word. They had told themselves the monster was gone, buried forever, but now the live feeds showed what their ancestors had feared, the figure walking through their strongest fortress like a shadow walking through smoke. Outside the moon, the orbital fleets began arming their weapons. Lines of massive warships aimed their cannons at the surface. Orders screamed through the comms to prepare to fire. But none of them moved yet, because even from orbit, even from the distance of the void, they felt it, that pressure in their bones, that quiet weight that made the stars seem smaller. Captains clenched their jaws, soldiers gripped their controls tighter, but their hands trembled all the same. One whispered what everyone else was already thinking. This won't work. Back inside the fortress, the human reached the surface elevator. The walls groaned as if trying to delay him, but the machine obeyed like an old dog recognizing its master. It lifted him through the layers of steel, past the dead soldiers, past the trembling machines, past the last of the alarms that had already lost their meaning. When the elevator doors opened to the surface, The frozen moon spread out before him, black skies, cracked plains, and the faint shimmer of fleets orbiting high. Above, the air was sharp and cold. The wind sliced against the ruins of war, and there he stood, one human beneath the weight of the galaxy, breathing slowly, as if none of this mattered, as if he had all the time in the universe. The surface defense towers locked onto him automatically. Hundreds of heavy cannons pivoted toward his figure. The targeting system screamed. The sky filled with the sound of weapons priming to fire, but he didn't move, he didn't even blink, and before a single cannon could shoot, every targeting system flickered out like candles in the rain. The entire network died in a single breath. The sky went silent, the wind stopped, the moon itself seemed to pause, and the fleets in orbit realized with cold horror that their weapons weren't responding either. One by one their power grids began to falter. One by one their targeting sensors went black, the same way they had during the war so long ago. The human tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something far away, maybe the stars, maybe the beating hearts of the ones watching him. And then he took a step forward, not toward the fortress, not toward the weapons, but toward the sky, as if daring it to stop him, and no one fired, because every soldier, every captain, every commander felt the same thing in that moment. The galaxy was not hunting a monster, the monster was walking toward them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fleets hung above the frozen moon like a wall of steel and fire, thousands of warships locked in a formation so tight it could block out the stars, engines humming low, weapons systems alive. The air around the moon vibrated with their presence. They were the pride of the Council, the largest defense force ever assembled, each ship built with the memory of the human they had buried centuries ago, every cannon, every shield, every protocol designed for one single purpose, to keep him from ever walking free again. But now he stood on the surface below them, alone, unarmed, breathing slowly beneath the red glow of broken alarms, and for the first time in generations, the fleets built to conquer entire galaxies hesitated, because the enemy they were facing was not an army. It was a memory carved into their blood. Command ships barked orders across the void. Captains screamed through their comms. Targeting systems tried to lock on, but every time they did, the systems flickered, power grids stuttered, alarms cut out. It was the same signature recorded in the oldest war logs, the one their ancestors swore they'd never face again. The moment before everything fell, some officers tried to hide their fear behind their training, repeating orders like broken machines. But their hands trembled, their voices cracked. They could feel it even from orbit, that invisible weight pressing against their chests, like gravity bending in ways it shouldn't, like the space around the moon wasn't theirs anymore, it was his. Down below, the human stood perfectly still, head tilted slightly upward, his breath curling in the freezing air. The wind howled across the dead ground, but it never touched him. The dust that blew against his legs seemed to avoid him, like even the elements remembered what he was. And in the silence between those howling winds, the galaxy listened, not with ears but with its bones, because this was the kind of silence that came before stars burned. This was the silence their ancestors had feared. Then the first captain broke. Someone always breaks first. A voice screamed through the comm network to fire, to end it, to drown the moon in plasma and erase the last trace of this nightmare. The order spread like wildfire through the fleet, ship after ship aligning their cannons. Rows of bright targeting lights igniting the darkness of space. Every barrel pointed at that one small human figure. The sky turned blood red from the charge, power built in a wave that made the void vibrate. And still he didn't move, not even an inch. He just stared back at the sky as if the storm above him was nothing more than a breeze. The first ship fired. A beam of burning light shot downward, tearing through the air with a scream like splitting metal. The ground shook as the blast hit. Flames roared across the surface. But when the smoke cleared, he was still there, standing exactly where he had been, untouched. The air itself shimmered around him like the universe refused to let their weapons touch him. One after another, more ships fired. Beams and plasma and energy storms rained down on the moon, turning the frozen wasteland into a burning crater. The sound rolled like thunder. The surface cracked and bled fire. And still, when the smoke parted, the human remained, calm, unmoving, the same quiet face staring up at them. And at that moment, the fleets remembered the old stories weren't stories, they were warnings. Panic bled through the channels, soldiers shouted over each other. Captains screamed for more power. Engineers begged for systems to hold together. Some ships began to back away without orders. Others fired wildly, as if drowning their fear in noise. The commander of the flagship clenched his claws around the armrest of his chair, staring at the readings as they went mad. Every blast they sent vanished into nothing. Every missile froze mid-flight like the void itself swallowed their rage whole. And then came the worst sound of all. Not an explosion, not screaming, but silence. The sound of their entire fleet's weapon systems shutting down at once. All at once, every cannon went cold, every targeting system went black, power cores flickered and fell silent. Shields collapsed like dying lungs. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't hacking. It was something older and far beyond anything their machines could resist. It was the same thing their ancestors had described during the last war. The moment when humanity had simply decided to stop fighting and the galaxy had fallen quiet out of fear. This wasn't war, this was judgment. The human lifted his head slightly, just a small movement, and the fleet flinched like someone had drawn a blade against their throats. He didn't roar. He didn't lift a weapon. He didn't even move forward, but every ship captain felt as if a hand had reached through their hulls and pressed against their hearts. Their breaths came short. Their limbs felt heavy. Some fell to their knees on their own bridges, choking on a fear they couldn't explain, a fear passed down through generations like a scar because their ancestors had stood in the same place once, facing the same silence, and they had lost everything. On the Council's homeworld, thousands of light years away, the broadcast feeds from the fleet came through in fragments, static swallowing the edges of the image, but the center was clear, a lone human standing on a burning moon while the most powerful fleet in the galaxy shook in its own orbit. The counselors who had pretended to be gods of the stars stared at the image with empty eyes. Some whispered that it was impossible, some whispered prayers, some simply stopped breathing, because they knew what came next. Their ancestors had written it down. Their bones had remembered it. Humanity didn't just fight wars, humanity ended them. Then, slowly, like a god waking from a long sleep, the old Terran frequency pulsed through the void, the same pattern that had echoed